I'll be starting the stream in 3, 2, 1. Okay, Paul, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, cool. Let's get this on. Okay. Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Mozilla Philippines Community online meetup for May 2022. Tonight is May 28, 2022. This is Bob Reyes. I'm one of the Mozilla reps based here in the Philippines. So just a quick introduction. So for tonight, we have a very special guest, Sir Paul Sears of Amazon Web Services. But before him, so let me introduce our community. So we are the Mozilla Philippines community, and we are the official community of Mozilla in the Philippines. Mozilla started a long time ago in 1998 as an offshoot of the Netscape Communications group. So there was a project called Mozilla.org. And as a global nonprofit, we have a manifesto. So we believe in many things. And among them, we have a pledge for a healthy internet. So we believe that for the internet to grow, we should be able to have a commitment to an internet that includes all the peoples of the earth. We should be committed to an internet that elevates critical thinking, reasoned argument, shared knowledge, and verifiable facts. So we should also have commitment to an internet that promotes civil discourse, human dignity, and individual expression. And lastly, we believe that we should have commitment to an internet that catalyzes collaboration among diverse communities that are working together for the common good. Here in the Philippines, we started operating in 2009, and currently we have a handful of leaders comprising the leadership of Mozilla Philippines Community, plus our awesome volunteers. What do we do? What's keeping us busy here in the Philippines? So we are localizing Firefox to Tagalog, Cebuano, and Hiligaynon, and maybe later on to different languages in the Philippines. We are advocating free and open source software, online security and privacy, just like what we are going to have tonight, with the help of our friends from Amazon Web Services and AWS Lab Pilipinas. And we are also creating a learning management system that will have online courses on localization, privacy, web development, and Rust programming. Hopefully, we'll be able to finish that very soon. Mozilla is well known for our product, which is Firefox. And when we talk about Firefox, we are talking about the family of products. So namely the Firefox browser, Firefox monitor, and a whole lot more. We have Firefox for desktop, for mobile, and other devices. So currently it's actually Firefox 100 now. I haven't updated that one yet, sorry. So we also have Firefox Relay. So if you want to have more security and control over your email by not giving your real email address to websites that you do not trust or you do not know, you may want to try relay.firefox.com. It will create a forwarder, an email forwarder, so that you don't have to give your actual email address, your real email address to different websites. If you're done using it, you simply log in back to relay.firefox.com and then delete the relay email address. We wish to thank our friends at apper.ph for hosting our Zoom meeting room. So thank you, apper.ph. So how to join our community? Very simple. All you need to do is go to join.mozillaph.org. We need all sorts of people who use and test our products, people who can help us spread the word about free and open source software and online privacy, and people who are willing to learn and to be trained in helping other people to become web literate. And generally just to become more awesome online. We are active on social media, so these are our touch points in social media. If you wish, you just go to our linktree /MozillaPH. Okay, everything is there. So if you want to get in touch with us, just send us an email via info@MozillaPhilippines.org or chat with us by the Mozilla chat room at chat.mozilla.org. Just search for the Mozilla Philippines chat room. That's powered by Matrix. Some updates. Mozilla Developer Network or MDN Plus is now available in selected countries. Read our announcement by hacks.mozilla.org. Mozilla also released the vision for the evolution of the web via webvision.mozilla.org. We will be conducting locally Rust 101, but this will be online, okay, since there's still an ongoing pandemic. So the announcements will be done via email and on our social media channels. And we have an ongoing localization project for Tagalog, Cebuano, and Hiligaynon. So just go to pontoon.mozilla.org. We also recently launched a free online course on the foundations of, together with the foundations of human technology. So just go to humantech.com/course. This is a free online course that is, basically the one mentioned in the Netflix documentary Social Dilemma. Okay, so try it out. Okay, so for tonight, we have a very special guest in the person of Mr. Paul Sears. Uh, Paul, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Cool. Very awesome. Okay, thank you for gracing our meetup for tonight.
Sure. What a
Okay,
better, what a, I couldn't think of a better way to spend a Saturday evening, right?
cool, cool. Yeah, rainy Saturday evening. Okay, so without further ado, I'll be handing over the virtual floor to Paul. Okay, so take it away, Paul.
Great. Okay. I need to share my screen. Let's see here. And okay, there we go. So hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes,
And
that
yeah,
one.
great. Okay. So this talk tonight is really more around privacy than anything else about workloads, cloud workloads in the Philippines. But it's focused mostly on that. But we're going to cover some basic stuff as well, and it's also geared towards AWS specific. But in full actuality, this could apply to any cloud workload and any provider. Some of the requirements and stuff here. So thanks again, Bob, for the introduction. As again, my name is Paul Sears. I'm a senior solutions architect with AWS Philippines. I have my contact information here if you need to reach out to me, either anytime, LinkedIn, as well as my email address. Let's go ahead and get started here. So as I mentioned, the driver of this session tonight was really around privacy, and privacy is part of the considerations for cloud workloads, and a lot of customers are exploring or in a process of transforming or undergoing what's called a cloud transformation, meaning that they're moving into the cloud from traditional on-premises workloads, or moving away from a private cloud or a private hosting into a public cloud such as AWS. And there's some advantages that customers have with this, such as the agility you gain and with a hyperscaler, the ability to have new features and things, services available. AWS has over 200 services you can incorporate into your applications very quickly and very easily. Operation resilience. AWS has I think we have 16 years of cloud experience. I forget the actual number now. We've been the longest of all the providers out there. We've been doing this since 2006. Also, you can potentially over time get cost savings. So compared to traditional CapEx purchases. So there are many different drivers that businesses are undergoing for this cloud transformation journey. There could be things, for example, they want to actually do a digital transformation, move their applications from on-premise, or actually, sorry, move their applications and services from a traditional brick and mortar type experience into a digital experience. Maybe they want to go global quickly. Maybe they have mergers, acquisitions. There could be new services or technology domains they need to incorporate, such as IoT or AI/ML. They want to either consolidate data centers or exit data centers altogether and let a hyperscaler such as AWS provide the infrastructure services for them. And ultimately, again, I did mention cost reduction as a driver for why businesses are really making this cloud transformation journey. But on the other side of that is that, and this is way more around the topic for tonight, is that this actually hasn't really changed in terms of it doesn't really matter where you're hosting your environment, but we have a lot of breaches in environments, right? So this is mostly around data breaches, and data is the ultimate keys of the kingdom, so to say. These are what we're trying to protect for our customers, because customers do not want to have their information revealed or released or inappropriately accessed. And so this is kind of older stat from 2019, but 2019 is almost 4,000 publicly disclosed breaches, and I'm sure there are far more that were not even disclosed at all, particularly small ones. And different countries and different different providers have different requirements around how they disclose breaches. 4.1 billion records of information were exposed, and a 54% increase in data breaches. You can imagine it's continued to increase. So accessing private information is very, very it's a big problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem in the future. And you got to think about when you want to move into a cloud journey, you take a cloud journey, and you're moving off on premises, and actually it actually applies to even running your own workloads, but on premises. But best intentions really aren't a strategy. You really got to understand your requirements, any laws. If you don't follow processes, you may risk heavy fines, and you need to really just be really thoroughly understand your customer data and what risks might be around that customer data, right? And what does personal data look like? So we call it PII, personally identifiable information, and it really depends ultimately. But here's some examples, because PII could be as simple as your name, or it could be a combination of different entities around your identity. For example, your name, your address, your email address, your phone number. Those in combination could be considered a PII record. So it depends on the industry, the segment. If you're looking at healthcare data, what is considered PII is different than maybe a financial data record. So this is actually very important to understand and be aware of, is that whatever segment of customers you're working in, whatever segment of industry you're following, you need to really understand what PII means for your requirements and regulations. So you got to know your landscape, you got to know requirements, okay? So let's talk about AWS. What AWS can do to help manage your risk? Because one of the things here, as I mentioned, you saw early on, is that there's a huge increase in the number of data breaches and either unintended or accidental releases. And so AWS has a lot of ways to help manage your risk, to minimize that risk to loss and unexpected or unintended loss of data. And so we have a number of services that can do that. We have encryption services, we have monitoring services, we have security and compliance services, identity access management service. These are just a small handful of the services we have available to customers in AWS to help them protect and ensure that they remain compliant, whatever regulations they need to comply to for their industry and the country they're operating out of. So, and we also have a huge compliance program at AWS. We have a number of global and Americas and Asia Pacific programs as well. So we have a lot of expertise in this area. We also have a number of third-party auditors that really help document our efforts to comply with requirements such as SOX 1, 2, and 3, and PCI DSS, for example. So we have all these things which you then can leverage and include into your own compliance reporting to demonstrate that you are also meeting compliance because your infrastructure that you're leveraging on AWS has already met the requirements by whatever regulators or governmental agencies or bodies that may be. So there are a huge number of privacy standards and regulations. And again, this is just a handful, but we actually have a portal that discusses various country related standards and regulations in general in terms of data privacy and country specific stuff, including things like GDPR, which is for EU citizens, meaning that you have to allow an EU citizen to have their data removed or delete themselves from your data collection, right? And understand too that this means that if you are a company, even if you're based in the Philippines and you have a customer that is an EU citizen, which is probable, it's very likely because you may have, like, so let's say an e-commerce website, and there could be, in country, and there could be an expat from an EU citizen who's in country using your website. You now have requirements to follow GDPR just because you have EU citizens accessing your services and you have EU citizen data in your systems. Therefore, you are required to follow or be GDPR compliant. Okay. AWS services themselves are GDPR compliant, but your applications you build on top of that also need to be GDPR compliant as well. So keep that in mind. Just because you're in the Philippines, you may also have risks of other countries' requirements based on the citizens, and the EU is the biggest one to worry about. Okay, so you have some normal considerations and relevant to privacy and data protection. This is really a general set of considerations you should be taking and thinking about when you're designing your architectures and you're having your workloads, your applications, and those things. So the practical matters to consider are: will the content be secure? Like, what are you doing around security? How are you doing security? Where will the content be stored? Are you storing it in the cloud in a region, or are you storing it in country? Do you have any requirements around that? Who will have access to the content? Who has access to that personal information, the PII from your customers, right? And what laws and regulations apply to the content, and what is needed to comply with these? So those are the really 4 primary things you need to consider when you're talking about data protection and data privacy in any country in the world and on a global landscape. But we're going to focus more specifically on the Philippines here in just a minute, okay? So let's talk about data security first, just at a high level. And I want to remind everybody, in case if you are an AWS customer, you already may be familiar with this, but if you're not familiar with this, hopefully this will help you understand some things. So AWS actually has what's called a shared responsibility model, meaning that security is a shared concept between AWS as well as the customer. And here's why that is so. Because AWS provides security of the cloud, meaning we're providing security of the infrastructure services and managed services that we're providing that you might be using. Okay, so the regions, the availability zones, the education, the physical aspects, security all around that, the personnel, the infrastructure itself, compute, storage, database, networking. These are the hosts or the infrastructure systems and network services and network devices, all those things that we are managing and providing for customers to use. We are in charge of ensuring that those systems and those infrastructure services are secure. Okay, so we have security of the cloud, but customers have a piece as well, because they are responsible for security in the cloud, meaning they're responsible for how they manage and protect their customer data. AWS does not have any access to customer data in a customer's account. Customers are responsible for defining and what the policies are and managing and controlling access to that data appropriately. Also, things like how a customer builds an application. What choices of platform do you use? What operating systems do you use? What ports do you allow in and out of your environment? Do you encrypt or not? What do you do around that? All those things are customer decisions, and those things, that's why customers have security in the cloud. So a combination of those working together can give you the highest level of security and protection of your customer data. But understand, customers have a responsibility to make the right decisions to protect customer data. Let's talk about data residency here. I did some research. Now, this is something that I'm not an expert, I'm not a lawyer on this, but I did some research about some various requirements. And this actually presentation that I built is more just a stepping stone, because data privacy and data residency are kind of a little nebulous or misunderstood in the Philippines. And so over time, hopefully we can get more refined and get more specific information. But I gathered some stuff so far based on various requirements. Let me talk about the first thing for data residency. So data residency means where can your data reside? Meaning, where can it be located? Can it be located? Is it required to be in country? Can it be in a private provider or data, on-premises data center, or can it be in a public cloud provider? Those kind of things, right? So what drives the data residence requirements? There's no actual Philippines laws that are defining data residency. However, DICT released an updated called Circular 010 on June 2nd, 2020, which is an amendment to how they handle the government's cloud first policy. And this circular really defines the government's requirements around government agencies or sub-agencies or anybody working with governmental data, what requirements you have for data residency. There are not any requirements for private sector, non-governmental bodies or agencies or organizations to have these only apply to government related data. Okay, keep this in mind. So here's a little table breaking down here, and I'll give you a link to the actual policy. You can go and download and read yourself. But ultimately, there are 4 levels of data within the Philippines government, and they call it highly sensitive government data, above sensitive government data, sensitive government data, and non-sensitive government data. And depending on the level of sensitivity of that data, what level category it's in, is what you can do, where the data must reside. So in a highly sensitive government data, you are allowed to have in-country private cloud. You cannot have that data outside of country, and it cannot be in a public cloud. It has to be in a private cloud or a private on-premises environment. And this is very, very specific for highly sensitive, more or less classified data. Okay, above sensitive government data, you can actually have your data, but it must reside in country. But you can also use an accredited public cloud, and it also must be encrypted. So for example, if there is a public cloud provider that has on-premises in-country infrastructure, then you can use those, and they've been accredited by DICT. You can actually use that provider for your above sensitive government data. For sensitive government data, you can put that into an accredited public cloud, as well as non-sensitive government data, you can put in accredited public cloud. So this is a very important thing. And make sure you understand these 4 categories of data. This is government data, and this is any government data around Philippine citizens that are being used by government or for government purposes. Now, it does not really apply to your e-commerce data that you're collecting on, like if you're, for example, running an e-commerce website selling products. It doesn't require that. However, you might have some data that might be required. For example, maybe it's going to be your tax data, your BIR data. BIR is a government agency, so that there's portions of your data that might require a different location or different residency than the data than the general data you may be working with. So you got to understand your data too. Think about those interlinkages and dependencies on that various aspects of data. Okay. So one thing you can do is we actually promote this as well, is that we actually like to have a life cycle for data, and life cycle data means that the data lives in existence over a period of time. It's born, it ages, and then it dies, right? And you also can store your data in different zones that may be relevant to life cycle of data, or even the classification, because classification of data changes at time as well. Maybe, for example, somebody's been classified, maybe unclassified, years later, when it's no longer a security risk or anything. So data can change its classification and sensitivity, and as well as whether or not it's government or becomes government down the road, or becomes public over time. So you got to have a life cycle. So you want to think about organizing your data lakes, your data organizations, how you do this into different zones that you can actually allocate and define where such data should reside to meet whatever requirements you might have from many governments. Okay, and again, we're talking most about the Philippines here, but this is a general practice that would apply for any workload in anywhere in the world. So as I mentioned before, we have a data. There are some levels of government data that require on premises or in country. Now, the highly sensitive data is not able to use a public cloud, but you might be able to use it for the above sensitive data. You can actually use a public cloud that's in country. Now, AWS at this time does not have any in-country services yet, but we announced in 2021 in reInvent that we're going to be providing a local zone, which means there'll be a subset of services that will be actually physically located in the Philippines, and that was actually specifically around providing use cases around data residency, as well as maybe highly sensitive latency issues. But also, in addition to that, you can actually, if you are running AWS right now, you actually can bring in pieces of AWS into your own on-premises data center or into your own private cloud environment using what's called Outpost Rack. And these are racks of AWS infrastructure that we build, assemble, install, and manage for you. This is an example. It looks like here you actually can get these now, order these now. There's a lead time for that to get the site survey and stuff, but we have customers now that are actually exploring the idea of bringing in some pieces of infrastructure of AWS into on premises to meet some requirements around, particularly around data residency. But also understand that it's managed by the region, so you still need to have your access to the region, which will be in this probably region will be Singapore most likely, to manage and manage services in this rack. Also, there's not everything available in AWS. There are only some services, but the core services are typically available. Things like, for example, EC2, which is the server instances, and you can actually get S3 storage locally, and you can get EBS, which is the raw storage for servers available, and you can do things like even ALBs for load balancing and caching, and even Dockers and Kubernetes management control planes. You actually can do this through here, as well as RDS databases. So you have the ability to run a subset of, but mostly core services that can typically address the requirements for workloads that have a data residency requirement. So you actually can successfully deploy this, or you can leverage the local zones, which were announced, and they will have a smaller subset of services. They will not have S3, but you'll have EBS, RDS, and EC2. So you can run a database server, which maybe the database itself needs to have remain the data local, and everything else could be residing actually in Singapore. So this is just something you can consider when you're looking at your data strategy and how to make sure you are compliant with the requirements around the data that you're dealing with. Okay. Another thing too is you want to understand how you manage PII. So a typical way is basically you might have a database, and you have PIs that is protected, and then you have need to match data using tokens and stuff. But there are other ways of doing this. And there's one called Senate matching, which is a new way of using node hashes so that the in PII, so the original text is not recoverable. So it lets you actually really obfuscate that data and distribute it across like a quorum, or basically, and distribute it out there so that you can actually have the ability of having a highly secure and no single company can match. So basically there's a consortium about how to do things, like we can actually set up services that can leverage a distribution of hashes to provide data. Okay, so it's a different concept here. It's pretty advanced and very few companies are actually exploring this, but you have options. So my point of this particular slide here is think about how you must address your different data needs. You're going to have different data needs as well, depending on what the data is and who needs to access it and where it is, and its sensitivity. So you need to have data classification well defined in your organization. So let's get into data privacy around the Philippines. And this is actually, I found this very interesting actually, because there's no actual statements around Philippines data, PII data, aside from government data, that needs to be, that has any requirements around residing in country. So let's go ahead and for example, we know that you can actually use your Philippines data in Singapore, hosted in the Singapore region. Okay, but let's get into different kinds of requirements around data privacy, since that's kind of an important conversation here. So the privacy is defined by Republic Act 10173, which is the Data Privacy Act of 2012, and this act really applies to the processing of personal information and any and how it's processed and who controls it, who accesses it, and such. So that this is just a subset of this document. I have a link to in my references here that you can go out and pull down a PDF, the actual Data Privacy Act, so basically it just defines what data privacy is and what it means. Okay. We also have a white paper we produced called Using AWS in the Context of Philippines Privacy Considerations. And there's a QR code here that you can snap and take a look at, and it'll link you to our white paper, which is the long URL down at the bottom here. But we actually have a white paper. We've done some research into this. So this is a very valuable, in my opinion, a very valuable resource that I went through today as well to make sure I understand any considerations as part of the discussion here, right? But it's pretty interesting. There's no considerations around residency of data aside from what was defined by DICT. Okay. So let's talk about some principles here. So there's different kinds of principles. I didn't cover all the ones in the privacy law, but I covered the main ones. And the first one is collecting of personal data. And this is, again, shows you how the privacy law was designed and drafted. It's really around describing what you do, how you get the data, how you handle the data, how you delete the data or dispose of the data, etc. Right? And we have in our white paper, we break it down into what the actual principle is, and then what the customer and AWS may or may not need to do with that, right? So for example, for collecting personal data, you only collect that is necessary and compatible with a declared, specific, and legitimate purpose. So you must have a legitimate reason to collect the data. You just cannot collect anything you want for whatever reason. You need to have a legitimate reason, and you need to declare it. You need to have a privacy banner, or when a customer signs up for your e-commerce website or whatever it may be, you need to disclose what data is going to be collected and how it will be used. Okay, so you need to have that, and you're also the people, your customers who are using, or the customers who you're collecting data from, they should be able to consent to it. Okay, so you should be able to consent to that data. So you need to have opt-in. Okay, you need to really think about that, how you design your systems around that. And then what happens, the customer, they control when and the customer itself, you as a customer, sorry, we have two levels of customers here. So your customers, they need to consent, and you need to declare to them that you're going to collect data and what you're going to collect and why, right? And now you as a customer of AWS, you determine what and control when, how, and why you collect the data from subjects, and decide whether to include that personal data in customer content and stores, processes, AWS services. So you basically control that data. You control what happens with it. AWS does not collect personal data from data subjects, which is your customers in the context here. and we don't have any contact with anybody else. So we don't have access to your customer data. You control that, and you need to figure out how you want to manage that. So understanding, you got it for collecting data, you opt in for your data subjects, your customers, right? Your customers need to opt into that. You need to be explicit about what you're collecting and why. Okay, processing data. So data should be processed in a manner and only to the extent necessary that is compatible with declared, specified, and legitimate purpose was collected. So you state why you're collecting that data and you're opt-in. You need to also make sure you're processing data in that context appropriately, okay? So you just can't say, oh, we're gonna collect your data and use it for X and then go do something else for Y. You need to be very explicit about what you're doing and stay within the boundaries that you defined that your data subjects, your customers have opted in for. So you can't deviate outside of the boundaries you created in that opt-in. Hopefully people understand that. I hope you all understand that, because it's very important, is that you need to really, they need to really be very clear how you process the data as well. And again, the customer, which is you, determines, controls why it collects the data, what it's used for, and so and so. And AWS only uses customer content to provide the services. We do not actually do anything. So you use our services, you provide data when necessary for the services, but we don't do anything with data. We have no access to your data directly and such. Okay. Data retention and deletion. This is important. So you really can't keep PII, personal data, forever unless you explicitly state you need to for a reason, and you follow your opt-in. So you should have, it should not be long and necessary. That's up to you to define what necessary. Is it a sales cycle? Is it a year? Is it 5 years? Whatever it may be, you define that, but you need to be very explicit about your retention period. And then you need to dispose the data in a secure manner and to prevent unauthorized processing, access to, or disclosure to any third party. And this doesn't apply necessarily to digital. This also applies to traditional as well, because maybe you have paper copies of things. Maybe you have forms you encode. Those also need to be destroyed or discarded in a secure manner, right? So you don't want the leakage happening. In this case, leakage digitally could be, you don't want to have unintended access to that data by a third party. And you want to make sure that you destroy any physical types of data as well. Okay, so that covers both sides here. And a customer, as a customer, only you know why data was collected, what's included. So you control, again, you control this. You should delete anonymized data when personal data is no longer needed. Okay, you should be doing these things here. This is what the privacy law kind of defines. In AWS, we provide you controls to enable you to delete content as well as describing documentation. I shorten this, is actually a lot longer than this, but you can get the full white paper and see this. But we give you ways to manage your data. It's up to you as a customer to make sure you do that and manage data appropriately per requirements of the Philippine data privacy law. Okay. And another thing here is security measures for the protection of personal data. So anybody who's controlling, anybody who's processing data, you need to implement reasonable and appropriate organizational, physical, and technical security measures for the protection of personal data. You need to make sure you don't have data leakage, whether it's physical documentation or data around a person or PII, or it's digital PII data. You need to take the right measures and have the right processes in place and controls in place to prevent any unintended leakage of that data. Okay, which means, for example, in the context of AWS, you just can't store your data in S3 in a public bucket. You need to make sure you have the right policies and controls in place and make sure that data cannot be inappropriately accessed. Okay, and so you can read this thing here. So it's very clear on that. And then again, we remind that customers are responsible for how they do security in the cloud, including security of their content, meaning you as a customer, you control security of how the data is managed. Okay, we as AWS are responsible for managing the security of the underlying cloud environment. So for example, there may be some services you might leverage that require you to provide data. I'm thinking more around the AI services. You may need to send a set of data to transcribe, right, to OCR that data, well, you need to provide that. AWS will manage security of that data once we receive it through the service, but you need to manage that data before you give it to us. Okay, again, that's part of the shared responsibility model. Okay, hopefully everybody's following along here on this, and I hope that we maybe have some good questions around this as well. Okay, so I'm gonna talk to one minor thing here, and I'm almost actually done with this. But this is something I want to get into as well, because digital banking is really accelerating in the Philippines, and I have a few extra pieces of information on digital banking. So digital banking is actually controlled by Banco Central na Filipinas, which BSP, and is really governed by Circular Number 808. And this is the guidelines, information technology, risk management for all banks and other BSP supervised institutions, which means if you want to do any kind of banking, if you're a fintech, FinServe, FSI, technology company, you need to comply with BSP Circular 808, and you need to get permissions of BSP to run your financial workloads in the cloud. And now we've worked very carefully with BSP. We have a great relationship with them, and we've actually helped many of our banking customers get approval they need to operate workloads. And one maybe might know this was Union Bank. Union Bank is AWS for their digital bank capabilities. We helped Union Bank work with BSP to get the approvals and to allow them to scale and run and develop and provide digital banking services using their solution on AWS. Okay, so we work with that, but BSP controls that aspect. So remember, different segments, different sectors, industry might have different regulatory requirements. You need to make sure you understand the landscape that you operate as you operate in with your customers. Okay. So one thing I'm thinking about, we actually have some really best practices around handling data and how to organize your security and your accounts. And we do this for definitely for banking, because banking is very needs to have a super level of secure, because it's a high target, right? High profile, high risk profile. So we have this concept called landing zone, and actually it's really now under what's called control tower, which is a service that manages what's called a multi-account strategy. Now, if you notice here, right, in this, for example, here, you're going to see this. I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen, it's a little small, but you're going to see under this region, AWS region, you're going to see all these accounts: network account dev, networking account test, networking account production, audit account, log account, banking workloads dev, banking workloads test, banking workloads prod. We actually promote as a best practice a multi-account strategy, but you need to have a way to manage that and make sure that multi-account strategy is secure, so you don't have any unexpected gaps or weaknesses in your security posture. So you leverage a service like Control Tower to deploy and manage policies across the organization that let you run multi-accounts, and therefore you can have things like detective services like guard duty running in those accounts, and to make sure that everything is behaving, or there's no nefarious activities and such. So this is a best practice architecture, and we actually recommend this for anybody who has any kind of PII data. They should be implementing a control tower and a multi-account strategy. But in particular, we spent a lot of time working with FSI banking customers on how to do it really well for banks. And you can leverage the same type of best practice is reference architecture for yourself, if you like, for whatever industry you're in that deals with PII. Okay. And I'm going to show you here a very complicated diagram. This is a reference architecture we've developed for digital banking customers. This also can apply for really anything. But you see here, this is kind of how we flow here, moving data through your different accounts. We have how you have interactions between your on-premises core systems and your digital systems in the cloud. You have different gateways for different branch offices and those kind of things. We have a reference architecture. We have these things you actually can follow and ensure you're going to have the highest level of security and operability and meet the highest level of compliance required for your segment, particularly for digital banking. But these type of designs we have for many different industries as well. We have a lot of reference architecture. So please go online and if you're ever curious, and look at solutions that AWS has for different industries, depending on what you do, manufacturing, retail, IoT type stuff. We have all these different things out there, but this is very mature now for banking, and a lot of the help of Union Bank helped pioneer a lot of this as well. We have a lot of banks around the world now who are operating the workloads in AWS, so they need to have a very, very high level of security and a very, very high level of control of the data moving through those various accounts within their organization. Okay, so that's what I have here. Finally, I have references, and I believe we'll give a slide. We'll distribute slides of these PDF of these slides at a later date. But you can see the 3 relevant government regulations that deal with different sectors, different kinds of data in the Philippines. The Data Privacy Act defines what data privacy means and how you manage data, and that you basically need to opt in your customers to allow them to collect the data. You need to be very specific on what data you collect and how you use it and how you process it, and you need to make sure you take security to protect it and you destroy it properly when you're done with it. But if you're dealing with any type of government related data, you may have may fall also under DICT circular number 10 amendments to their document from 2017. So you can read that as well. And then if you're in a financial services industry, BSP 808 is also a requirement for you. So that's really all I have for this. And I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. It's a lot of information, but really comes down to just thinking about how you manage your data. And what take away from this is that you need to know your data profile. You need to know what is considered PII, the life cycle of that data, how it's going to transition through various stages throughout the time of a customer. When a customer leaves your system, let's say a customer never actually, they buy one thing and then they're gone and never see them again. How long do you keep their profile around? Is there a time required based on regulation? Do you have that defined? Do you define that in your opt-in policies, right? What do you do? What's the life cycle you define of that? So you need to have those things, think about those things, and consider those when you're running workloads. And it's actually not just cloud, AWS cloud, but also on-premises applies as well. But for AWS, very much you need to really think about this. I also want to make one last comment too, is that AWS does not move your data anywhere. So if you put your data in a region, or you put your data into a outpost rack, or you put it into a local zone, your data stays there. It never migrates away unless you do so. To be totally transparent, there are other cloud providers that you have less control of where your data is going to reside over time. Okay, so you should be aware of that. I'm not saying one's good or bad, but you should understand whatever provider you're using, whether it's private or public cloud, you need to understand how they move your data, if they do at all. It's very, very important for you to understand that, because ultimately you are responsible for complying with those requirements. Okay, so also final consideration too, if you have any EU citizens interacting in your systems, you better make sure you understand GDPR compliance, and you better make sure you have the ability to delete EU citizen data, right? That's going to cost you a lot of money. If a EU citizen tries to delete their profile and they can't, you can get fined tens of thousands of euros on a daily basis. It's very, very expensive penalties. So you need to make sure you're aware of that. Okay. And we're a global, the internet makes things easy to sell across the world. If you have, and we're mobile, and we have expats everywhere. So think about that. Just because you're selling to Philippines customers does not mean you don't have any expats or any EU citizens as part of your customers. Okay. Okay, that's all I have. So we can do some Q&A now. If anybody have any questions, please, by all means, feel free to open up or the mic or message us, and we'll hopefully answer them for you. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on this, but I've done my research, and obviously this is evolving as the governments get more savvy around cloud computing as well.
Here, awesome. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, for those who are joining us via Zoom, feel free to use the chat function of Zoom or raise your hand or just unmute yourself. For those who are tuning in by the Facebook live stream, feel free to use the live chat function of Facebook. Maybe I'll go with the first question. Since AWS is a cloud provider, how do you treat the ownership of data? Say, I am a company working from the Philippines, so I'm based in the Philippines, but my data is I'm using AWS server, say in Singapore. So how will be the treatment of that data? Is that data governed by Singaporean laws or by Philippine laws?
It's actually a really good question. The way you rephrase the last part, because the first part of the question was, well, obviously the customer, you as a customer, you control that data. So AWS does not control your data. But you actually raised a very good question that I don't want to have an answer to yet. I need to go back and research that because I don't know. I don't know. I can't say for sure. I haven't come across reading anything where it says if you have your data residing in a different country, does that country's laws also apply? I do not know that, and I don't want to guess and get it wrong. So let me follow back on that. That's a great question. But in general, you as a customer, any data you collect of your own customers, your data subjects, you are responsible for, and you're responsible for meeting whatever requirements that are wherever that subject exists, wherever they reside, right? So if they are EU citizen, you need GDPR. If they are a Philippine citizen, you need to follow some of the data privacy stuff like opting in and those kind of things. So in that regard, I think that wouldn't matter. That wouldn't change if your data is being hosted in Singapore, you're storing your customer data. If you're storing Philippines customer data in Singapore, because there's a region there, the Philippines data privacy requirements still require, but I don't know if anything additional happens. That's a great question. I will research that. I like that question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Another question is, when it comes to best practices in data collection and storing them, companies tend to over collect data. So what can you suggest on how companies, especially the startups, avoid that kind of problem that they tend to collect so much data wherein they only need a handful?
Right. That's a great question. And we see this problem, like you said, a lot of companies do this. We collect too much. And a lot of countries now are requiring more specific statements about how data is being collected and used because we see all these breaches, right? And when I came from the US, is really, really bad there. Everybody has your data. Every company can buy and sell your data. It's really terrible. And it gets to be a mess when there's a breach. You know, you have a breach of 100 million records from a telco. That means everybody has your data, right? And they have all this data never should have. So it's a great question. And I know one thing about the Philippines too, which really drives me nuts, is that when we fill out any forms, they ask so much personal data as well, right? Why do they ask these things? Why do they need this data they're asking, right? And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding what data privacy is. But the Data Privacy Act in the Philippines does describe that you collect what you need to collect that's appropriate. So it's up to you to define that, but you need to disclose what you're collecting and why you're collecting it, right? So that's the requirement. So back to your question, how do you manage that? So first of all, we have this concept in AWS called working backwards, and that means you start at the solution you want to achieve. What is your objective, and you go backwards from there. And so what as part of that process is you always ask why and why and why, and you end up defining a persona, like who is a various personas of your using of your services, your customer's persona. So once you understand your customer persona, you might then be understand what data is relevant to that customer, right? So let's say you're an e-commerce company, right? There's two kinds of data. There's data that's PII related, which is maybe transactional data or profile data around a person. And there's data that's operational, like clickstream logs and those kind of things, right? The clickstream will separate your data. Make sure you have different data repositories in your data lake, different zones, and you keep those partitioned out there. You keep PII in the PII zones. You keep your operational data, your reporting data, whatever else metrics around that in your operational zone, and therefore you can have different life cycles on that. But always collect the minimal you need to collect. I would say operationally collect as much as you want, actually, because it doesn't hurt you. It doesn't hurt anybody, but it does definitely can add you value internally. But per PII, be careful with it, because understand what it means if a persona data was released, how impactful would it be, right? So it really comes down to just what are you trying to do in your business, your segment, your industry you're in, what data makes relevant sense. Like for example, if I am if I'm applying for a job, right? And this is something that really drives me crazy here in the Philippines. Why do I have to why do I have to submit a 2x2 picture on my resume? How is that relevant to my capabilities and ability to do my job, right? Now, I understand for some industries, maybe there's a need for it. And I know every country is different, right? But in, like, for example, in the United States, that is not a practice. You don't provide provide any personal information on your resume. You don't provide your marital status or your weight or your height. You don't do that, but we do that here. And the question is, why do we do that? Maybe because we've always done that and someone thought we had to do that. I don't know. And those are questions we should be asking as customers of our, as customers of these businesses, why they're doing this, right? But if we're doing it, if we're collecting that data, we need to state we are collecting it and why. So I didn't really answer your question very well, but I think you need to really understand who your target is, who your data subject is, and what they are trying to do. What are you trying to do with them? Are you selling them something? Well, then the data you're selling, there's certain data that's going to be very PII and certain data that's maybe not so much, and separate those out there and manage them separately, right? And that way you can keep them scoped appropriately and minimize the PII scope and maximize the operational scope, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, maybe last question from me. Since AWS is promoting a shared responsibility model, where will as a cloud provider, where will your liability in case of a data breach ends? In so something to that extent.
Okay. Again, I'm not an attorney and I'm not sure how I can answer this question on AWS context, but I can't speak for AWS liability. We have things in our terms and conditions. We have things around our SLA agreements, and we have things in contracts that are, I really can't speak to because I'm not a lawyer. However, understand that I know as a customer, you are responsible for the data ultimately, and how you implement your systems to use that and collect that data. So if you build an application and your application is vulnerable to something where you get someone can pull your database down, that's ultimately going to be customers. You as a customer on AWS, it's going to be your responsibility to deal with that. Now, if it was resulting from a service that you leveraged, that service had a leakage of some sort, that's probably a more of a discussion for an attorney, right? But I think even still, you should have the mindset. You should operate always with data that you, as the custodian of the data, you are always responsible for it, no matter what. I think if you start there and you focus on that, you'll always do the right thing around customer data.
Awesome. I asked that question because before someone asked me, what if the one who collected data is no longer responding and the PII the person wants his or her PII to be deleted
Yep.
from say a database. So maybe they were thinking maybe it's a good idea to go directly to AWS and ask for our data to be deleted, or
Yeah, so we couldn't do that in that sense. However, the AWS can comply under certain law enforcement requests, right? Like, for example, in the United States, if a court subpoenas records, they can do that. So, and even then, it's still very hard. It's a very, very high bar, right? And we don't have we don't have access to customer data. For example, if you put your data on EBS volume and use your own keys to encrypt that data, we have nothing we do with it, right? We can't do anything with it anyway. So it's you ultimately, and they would subpoena you. So if you as a customer working with a business and the business not responding to you, then that's where you go and pursue those avenues through the data, I forgot the organization that manages the Data Privacy Act, but they're the ones you go through, and there's a process for how you will escalate that and get that resolved, right? There's ombudsmans and whatever they are, and those type of things. So our government bodies and personnel that their job is to help remediate these things. And like in the US, there's a whole bunch of consumer protection agencies as well. So every country has that. They're dealing with that right now. It's a tough issue because we've had a data explosion, and now countries are starting to put requirements around how to protect that data. And then sometimes it's like the horse already left, the horse has already gone in the barn. So now you're building a barn for the new horses, but the old ones have long escaped, right? So you have to go back and you have, as a consumer, you have avenues. You just got to research them. Unfortunately, they're not always reliable, but you do the best you can, right? And unfortunately, good and bad, social media can be a great mechanism. Right. I've seen a lot of things happen through Twitter posts, right? Not saying it's the right way to do it, but I've seen a lot of things happen that way. So, and I'm not suggesting that either. I'm just saying that there are, you can probably find a way, but if it's a serious enough breach, you can find the way.
Yeah, maybe just thinking wildly out of the box. So there's a question here from the Zoom chat, from Jake. So if a client, if a client or customer will discontinue the use of AWS as their cloud provider, as their cloud provider, can the customer get their data from AWS? How sure the customer data is secured and not being used in other ways?
That's a great question. And because the customer owns the data in their own accounts, you have the ability to download or to transfer the data off those volumes yourself. AWS will not do that for you because we don't access your data. So understand, unlike a service like, so there's different kind of services. Let me give you a really good example. So obviously those are using Gmail, right? It's more of a SaaS. You're using an email service on Google's cloud, right? So you don't have access to the volumes your data is stored on. You didn't build that. You're using Google as a SaaS, a software provided service, right? So you're using a mail client, and they give you a mechanism to get your data through that, because you need a way to do that. If you leave Google, you leave Gmail, go somewhere else, you can actually download your data. But when you're building your infrastructure on AWS or even Azure or even GCP, for that matter, when you're working at the infrastructure level, you have access to the data volumes yourselves. The providers do not. So you would have the same mechanisms to do an SCP or FTP, the data off. You would need to do that yourself. So you can, a lot of ways you can do that. You can do backup and restore. You can, whatever mechanisms, when we give you tools to do that, but that'll be up to the customer to pull that data. Once you delete an EBS volume, so ultimately you're using AWS till you turn off all your services, right? Including deleting all your data volumes. And when you delete a data volume, that data is gone. It's automatically wiped. So you don't have the ability to get that back unless you did a snapshot and then you delete the snapshot. So again, that data is lost. So we don't have the ability to give it to you in that regard, because you're building it yourself. It's like no different than your own data center. If you want to turn your servers off and pull your data out of that service, how do you do that? FTP or SCP or a backup or some mechanism. Same thing you would do on AWS.
Awesome. So yeah, Jake, hopefully your questions got answered by Paul there. Okay, so let me just check. Anyone else who has questions for Paul before we let him go? Okay, going once, twice. Okay, so there. Thank you, Paul, for spending your Saturday night with the Mozilla Philippines community. We truly appreciate your talk on privacy and on how workloads, cloud workloads in the Philippines will be able to tap the different services of Amazon Web Services.
Ray, my pleasure, and hopefully this was useful. It's a tricky subject, and I think we're going to continue to evolve this over time as governments get better at it and we understand what they want to do better as well, right? So we're always some little gray area sometimes.
Okay, last one. There's a question here in the chat from Mark Wynn. Any timeline for a full-fledged AZ in the Philippines? There's been a flurry of new data centers, and I feel many companies would definitely want some of the big three clouds here.
So to be totally transparent, I have no idea. But we did publicly announce that we were going to have a local zone here. We announced it at reInvent in December, which means it'll be a subset of services in AWS that will reside physically in the Philippines, basically be RDS, EC2, EBS. I think that's the extent of a local zone, if I remember. Which means you can actually have a server in and block storage in Philippines as part of AWS, right? I don't have an ETA when that's going to be ready, but it was announced in December, and local zones, I mean, I would expect if it'd be great into this year, but probably next year. I don't know for sure. And as far as like a larger implementations as a region, it really comes down to what customers not want. And if enough customers are demanding AWS services as a region in country, that might happen. And I don't know if it does or not. I have no idea if it's happening now or not. I don't know. I don't have any visibility of that whatsoever. But for example, we recently launched Jakarta. Jakarta was launched in November, December of last year. It takes a couple of years, it takes 3 or 4 years to get a region online. It's been announced a while ago. It finally opened for general access in, I believe it was late November, early December last year. So yeah, so it's possible, but I don't know. But for sure, we did announce local zones, so that will happen. So that at least you know that there will be something here. But again, I also pointed out, you can right now today deploy outpost racks in your data centers yourselves or in your providers. For example, let's say you're using a local provider at a private cloud. You can bring in a rack of services that give you access to EC2, RDS, S3 and stuff, and you can bring it in there and manage it from Singapore, and you have access to AWS services in country, right? So it's not quite the same. It's more of a hybrid, but it still allows you to meet any data residence requirements, and allows you also to have maybe lower latency connections between your on-premise equipment and the racks yourself, because they're residing in your data center. So yeah, I mean, it's already partly there. It's just not a full region at this time.
Awesome. Yeah. I saw those outposts during 2019 reInvent. I
Yep.
was there. Yeah. And
Yep.
awesome piece of machine.
Yep. Actually, this is what a rack looks like. That's an AWS rack right there.
Yeah, yeah. I was asking the guy who's manning the booth and asked, can I have one at home? I said, no, probably not. They will not allow you to have something like that at home unless
But
you are a
well,
corporation.
so actually, I'm going to say now maybe you could, because they now have what's called outpost rack servers, where you can
Oh,
get a 1U or 1U Linux server or 2U Windows server individually shipped, and you can deploy in your office, which could also be your home for that matter. So in a roundabout way, you could probably do that. Now, these things aren't cheap. You're leasing them for 3 years, so it's like you would lease any other piece of equipment, right? It has a price. It's not like buying a 40,000 peso server and deploying in under your desk. It's going to be expensive over time, but it's intended for certain use cases. So technically, you probably could do that now, Bob, but it might not be so inexpensive, right?
yeah, yeah. And the cost of electricity in the Philippines is really high.
Yes, it is. That's true.
Okay. There. So Marquin, so we hope that your question got answered by Paul. Okay. So anyone else? Okay. Okay, cool. So there, thank you very much, Paul, for spending your Saturday night with us. And yeah,
Sure.
it just so happened that this week was National Privacy Commission's Privacy Awareness Week. So we are still
Great. Actually, I was not aware of that. So that's
we're
funny.
still within that week. So this is part of our celebration of privacy awareness. Okay.
Great.
So thank you, and until next time. So
Sure.
we hope that this will not be the last that we are having
Yes.
you. Okay, for
Great.
our meetups. Okay.
Great.
For those who are joining us, maybe if you can please accomplish this event feedback form when you're free. So just scan the QR code. So our friends from Educación, PH, AWS, and AWS Club Pilipinas, and Mozilla Philippines, we would love to hear your feedback about events like this and how we can improve and bring you more knowledge sharing sessions like this in the near future. Okay? So this is Bob Reyes from the Mozilla Philippines Community. Maraming salamat po at mag-ingat po tayong lahat. Bye-bye. There.